Living overseas changed the way that I looked at the world. Being in a different country, you want to think that you have control and you have this amount of free will that's not affected by what's around you. But really, I learned that whether you realize it or not, what is around you will affect you. So I remember back in my university when I was studying Japanese, we would often talk about culture shocks that people going to Japan would experience. And I remember thinking that most of them were pretty small and innocuous, kind of cute, like no tissues in the bathroom, wearing slippers to the bathroom, female cleaners working in the male bathroom. Come to think of it, I guess it mostly revolved around bathrooms. But the story that I'm building to is certainly what I would call a shock. But more than that, my honest feeling at the time was heartbreak. Now, if you want to, you can chalk that up to a grown man being too sensitive. But that really is how I felt. I've experienced a lot of cultural differences, and I've experienced a lot of truly termed shocks in my 5 years living in Japan, some of which I will address in later videos. But this is probably the most singular experience of just shock and puzzlement I had over there. So here's the story. My wife and I would usually go shopping at a local supermarket for most of the food for the day because it was only about a 3-minute walk from our house. And it was on the way home from the station. But every now and again, just for being different, we would go on a small train trip to a different market. And one of those different markets was Costco. So it amounted to about a 20-minute walk from our house to the train station, then maybe a 30-minute train trip from our station to the station we want to go to, and another 20-minute walk from that station to the Costco. So all in all, it would be a few hours. So we usually saved it for our joint day off, which was usually Monday, and we would just make a day out of it. So we would stop off at, some interesting places along the way. We would, detour, go to a local park, or even eat lunch at a small restaurant. This day I'm going to talk about was one such day where we stopped off at a McDonald's that was on the way to Costco. So we stopped at a McDonald's, we ordered, sat down to eat, and at some point in our lunch, from our table at one end of the restaurant, I noticed there was a woman who had finished and was leaving at the other end of the restaurant. This woman, a mom, was pushing her stroller, and she was clearly having a little trouble. So the way the exit was built, which is something I've seen before, and I think it's fairly common, there was a door, and then there was a small hallway, like maybe 1 or 2 meters, and then another door. I'm not 100% certain. I think it's like a little chamber, to keep flies out or something like that. But anyway, the woman had to do some fancy kind of shuffling around to, open the door with one hand, push in the stroller, and then squeeze in herself. So by the time that I looked over and noticed her predicament, she was just finished getting into the mini hallway and letting the door shut behind her. And she was going to move to open the other door and get out. And this would involve, once again, squeezing her body around the stroller, extending her arm to push the door, and reaching back awkwardly to, push the stroller through one-handed. And it was at this time that I noticed there was a young guy who had just come to the McDonald's walking up on the other side of the door. So if you could see where I'm going with the story, and you can understand why I call it heartbreaking, you probably can figure out what's going to happen next. But first, let me just put to you a simple question. If you were the young man in this situation, in other words, you saw a woman who is caught awkwardly in this little hallway and is actually kind of blocking your path to get in, what would you do? Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest there are only about 2 options, and one of those options is about 100 times more viable than the other. So basically, you can open the door for her and let her pass through, or you can not open the door, try and go around her, letting her deal with getting the door open on her own. Now, at the time, I think I was about 28 years old, and it was around the beginning of my second year living in Japan, so all of the other 27 years of my life had been spent in my home country of America. So even though I was in the middle of making this really concerted effort to learn the language and learn the culture of Japan, my cultural background and my moral compass was created and developed in the USA. So there were certain things about life in Japan that I just never experienced. And certain ideas that had been so ingrained in my psyche, and they'd kind of remained unchallenged, or for lack of a better expression, I didn't know what the challenge to those beliefs would look like, if that makes any sense. There are certain possibilities that just don't really enter your mind. So in this case, I really didn't consider the possibility that the guy wouldn't open the door for her. So that's why my jaw kind of dropped when the boy opted for choice two. I guess it wasn't just that he didn't open the door for her and let her out, but it was the way he did it. He opened the door, squeezed in, and he shuffled around the woman and made his way past her. But the whole time he did it, and he did it very quickly, the whole time he did it, his eyes were just glued to the floor. Now, there's simply no way he didn't see her, and he didn't notice what was going on. But that didn't stop him from doing this strange, pretendy, I can't see you dance. Which, being as I was a big foreigner living in Japan, who, lots of people kind of get scared of just on sight, I can't say that I'm a stranger to the I can't see you dance. But this was a fellow Japanese person, with whom there's no language barrier, and honestly, not much need to communicate with in the first place. I really got to know the I can't see you dance, and it wasn't until much later, after more experience, that I realized just how much a part of typical Japanese culture, and to be fair, probably most especially Tokyo culture that was. Now, all this happened in the space of about a few seconds, but that few seconds, it just blew my mind. I couldn't believe it. To put it the most simply that I can, I'd never seen a person treat another person so coldly for absolutely no reason. Now, I've seen people treat each other in a brutally cold fashion before. I mean, being as I am a huge fan of MMA and boxing, I've seen some really cold sights. But at least I can say that when a guy pounds on another guy whom he's already knocked unconscious, I'm not confused by it. While I don't agree with his motivations, I can at least understand what they are. This time, this kid just dodging around this woman, this kid was just so cold and so immediately unsympathetic in a way that didn't really make sense. There was no reason that he shouldn't have opened the door for her, almost any way you look at it. I mean, you can look at it from the angle that he would have helped out a fellow human being, who clearly needed a hand. You could feel a little happiness knowing you did a good job. Or there's the chivalry angle, where this was a woman who needed a little help, and this is a young guy who can be her white knight and, feel happy about it. And even if you want to take it to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, and you only want to think about yourself, well, it seems to me like he could have made it easier for himself, avoiding all that awkward shuffling, if he would just let her clear out first. So for me, it just seems like there's no reason not to lend a hand in that situation. Now, as a quick aside, I think I know why he didn't do it, or at least I think I've probably learned the tenets of the way of thinking that would lead you to that kind of action. But that'll be a topic for another day. On this particular day, this young guy's casual coldness just blew me away. And I remember turning to my wife and asking her if she saw what happened, and she said yes. And then I got another little surprise when I said, "Is that rude, what he just did? Or do you think most Japanese would think that's rude?" And she said, "No, it's not really rude." So we kind of talked about it, and she elaborated. She basically said that she would have held the door, and it would have been nicer if he did too. But in Japanese society, what he did is not really considered a bad thing per se. Uh, he didn't really know her, and he didn't owe her anything. And while people at their jobs have a responsibility to show courtesy to customers, when people are not at their jobs, there's no such mandate that they have to be, or they have to show kindness to others. Now, that's not to say that Japanese people just generally treat each other like dirt. But I will say with confidence that the "I can't see you" dance is a fair criticism of modern Japan. Now, I can imagine there might be some people who, after hearing that story, are thinking, okay, that's it. That's the big heartbreak. Some kid not opening a door for a lady. Who gives a shit about that? There are worse tragedies in the world than some dud on the far side of the world who refused to step up to the plate. Okay, I'm with you. I wholeheartedly agree. There are numerous very serious and very grievous issues that affect people in the world, and they're categorically more tragic than a kid not opening a door. Wars, poverty, murder, drugs. All of those topics are actual things. They're tangible, and real people, in actuality, suffer from those issues every day in the world. But if you will, there are two things I'd like to say about that. Number one, I think as a writer or even as any kind of artist or producer of content, I think that one's best work comes from a real place. So I was lucky enough to be born in a country where the standard of living is high enough to afford me general comfort in my life. I've never been a soldier, I've never been a war journalist, a missionary, or a refugee, running in fear of my life. I've never had that experience. I was a simple warehouse worker, then I was a student of Japanese, and then a teacher of English. I went from living in California to Hawaii and then to Japan. All of which are very nice, very beautiful places, to live and enjoy life. So while there are serious problems that are rampant in certain parts of the world, I feel like for me to kind of forcibly try and inject myself in my opinions into them would feel disingenuous even to me. It's kind of akin to me stepping up on a stage and then trying to rap about, growing up in the hood or something like that. It wouldn't work. And it wouldn't work, not the least because I couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. It wouldn't work because it just isn't me. And it isn't honest. So the topics that I intend to speak about, and that I want to use this channel to talk about, they're issues that I feel like I do have a good cause to talk about. And I think they're issues and ideas that many people, especially people who are not Japanese, spent time in Japan, they've dealt with at one time or another. And for those who haven't, maybe I can just present some kind of interesting food for thought. The other thing I'd like to say is, and once again, I want to do a separate video that explores the topic more thoroughly. It's my belief that basically, in many ways, it really is small problems and subtle problems that are so much harder to deal with than wide open and conspicuous tragedies. If society shows an image of like a rapist murderer, terrorist, just someone like that, we can all kind of collectively point to it and shout bad, right, or enemy. That's the problem. We can all formulate a good punishment for the bad person, and we can all feel a kind of catharsis when we know that person got the justice they deserved, like a Hussein or a Bin Laden or someone like that. That's not the case for relatively little issues. Um, relatively little issues, they don't get that little, wrapped up neatly in a nice little package storybook ending. The problem is they often never end. When I was in Japan and on my weekends away from teaching, I would go to the local city hall for free Japanese lessons with these local elderly volunteers. One of the teachers I had was a guy who was maybe in his 70s or 80s. And this guy was really, really, really interesting guy. Really old guy, but very genki, very, very energetic guy. And one of the most interesting stories he told me was how when he was a boy in the 1940s, and how he survived the bombing of Tokyo. Now, what he was telling me was just an aside to the main story he was telling me, but he said that he was the only one of his elementary class to live through the carpet bombing. All of the other children in his class were killed. All of them. But the thing about it that truly blew my mind was he was laughing as he was telling me this. Our conversation was all in Japanese, but what he said was something like, you got them all. You burned every last fucker except me. And like, for me, it was really strange for him to express himself that way. But what that really showed me was that things like, stark and brutal tragedies, given proper time, they eventually can have a silver lining. I really believe that. I think arguably one of the worst tragedies to befall anyone would be a child who has to come face to face with death, much less the deaths of all the children around you. The people in your class, the ones you're kind of growing up with and just meeting and just learning about. To have all that ripped away from you at such a young age, that's something that I will never truly understand. But this guy knew it. He lived it. And most importantly, it might seem callous that he would laugh at it, but what that tells me is that somewhere in his heart, he made peace with what happened. Now, I don't know how long it took him to do that, but somewhere along the line, I think that he actually found satisfaction and was able to move ahead with his life. And in a nutshell, that's why the story of the kid dancing his little I Can't See You dance affected me the way it did. Because unlike any kind of great tragedy, I will never find satisfaction or closure to that story. It will always sit there and continue to just make my brain itch, and I'll never be able to scratch it. Even if I could somehow round up the kid and the woman and try and get them to talk it over, it's probably so far gone and insignificant, even to them, that either one of them probably doesn't remember or care the slightest bit. It just kind of stuck with me because of my unique angle on the whole matter at the time. So, while the great tragedies of our lives can give us this solid platform, or a fixed event that we can focus our emotions onto, and help us get past them, it really is the small and seemingly insignificant problems that act like this just invisible nail in your head that just gets tapped and tapped and tapped and tapped incessantly. What really drives us insane in the end is not necessarily the pain of the nail, but the simple fact that we can't remove it. So basically, that's the story I wanted to tell you guys. In closing, I would like to say I hope you got something out of this. Maybe there are some people out there who have had similar experiences or can relate to that. Maybe you've seen the exact same phenomenon but played out in a different situation. Or hopefully you just learned something new. In either case, that's the story I wanted to tell. So if you have anything to add or any questions, please feel free to leave comments. Thanks for listening. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu.